Rowan stood at the entrance of the Orpheus Theater, his fingers tightening around the invitation in his hand. The building loomed before him, its once grand facade now worn by time. Faded banners fluttered weakly in the wind, and the scent of dust and aged wood filled the air. It had been closed for decades, yet tonight, the doors stood open. The lights glowed warmly from within, casting long shadows onto the street. His heart pounded with excitement and something else, something uneasy. Rowan had dreamed of performing on a stage like this. The invitation had arrived mysteriously, unsigned, offering him the lead role in the theater's grand reopening. An opportunity too good to refuse. As he stepped inside, the old wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. The interior was stunning, ornate gold trim, deep crimson curtains, and velvet seats arranged in perfect rows. Yet it felt empty, not just in the way an abandoned place should feel. Something was missing. Or perhaps something was watching. A voice cut through the silence. Our leading man has arrived." Rowan turned to see a tall, thin man in a deep blue coat, his smile sharp and knowing. His eyes gleamed under the dim chandelier light. "I am Mr. Duval, the director," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "You are Rowan?" "Yes," Rowan nodded, shaking his hand. "Excellent," Duval's smile widened. "Then let us begin. The stage has been waiting for you." Rowan's stomach twisted. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he heard strings tightening. The stage was vast, its deep red curtains drawn back to reveal a beautifully painted backdrop of a moonlit city. Rowan stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished wood. It was surreal. A place like this, abandoned for decades, shouldn't feel so alive. Mr. Duval stood at the edge of the stage, watching him with a keen eye. "Take your place, Rowan," he said smoothly. "The script is waiting." Rowan moved to center stage. On a nearby wooden chair, a stack of aged papers sat neatly, the title written in elegant script, "The Marionette's Game." He flipped through the pages. The lines were oddly familiar, as if he had rehearsed them before, but he hadn't. Something about this was wrong. "You will get used to it," Duval said, almost reading his mind. "The theater has a way of making the story feel natural." Rowan swallowed hard. "Who else is in the cast?" A pause. Then Duval gestured to the shadows backstage. Rowan turned and his breath hitched. Lined up behind the curtain stood marionettes, dozens of them. Life-sized, dressed in elaborate costumes, their painted eyes staring blankly ahead. Some looked old, their wooden faces cracked, while others appeared nearly new. Rowan's skin prickled. "Are these props?" Duval's expression remained unreadable. "They are performers." Rowan gave a nervous chuckle. "You mean puppeteers use them?" Duval didn't answer. Instead, he clapped his hands once. The marionettes shifted. Rowan flinched, his heart slamming against his ribs. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. A tilt of a head, a slight twitch of fingers. They had moved. No strings, no puppeteers. Just movement. His throat went dry. "That's a trick, right?" Duval's smile grew. "You'll find that this theater has many secrets." Rowan took a slow step back. His instincts screamed at him to leave. But then one of the marionettes turned its head toward him. The wooden lips parted. And in a voice just like his own, it whispered, "Welcome to the show." Rowan stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The marionette's painted lips had moved. Its voice had matched his, but that was impossible. His pulse pounded as he looked toward Mr. Duval, expecting an explanation. Some clever illusion, a trick of sound, but the director simply smiled. Waiting, watching, Rowan took another step away from the lifeless figures. The marionettes stood motionless now, their glassy eyes staring past him, if nothing had happened. "Good," Duval finally said. "You are reacting just as expected." Rowan frowned. "What does that mean?" Duval's fingers tapped against his cane. "You should go home and rest. The real performance begins tomorrow." Rowan wanted to protest, wanted to demand answers, but something in Duval's gaze made it clear. The conversation was over. His skin crawled as he left the theater that night. That night, Rowan woke to the sound of applause. His eyes shot open. His apartment was dark. the only light coming from the street lamp outside. For a second, he thought he had imagined it. But then, clap, 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 the sound was muffled, distant like it was coming from behind a curtain. Rowan sat up, every muscle in his body tense. His apartment was empty. He turned toward his bedroom mirror. His reflection wasn't moving. Rowan's breath hitched. He lifted his hand. His reflection did nothing. Then clap, clap, clap. The sound was inside the room now. Rowan spun around. No one was there. His chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. His own reflection was watching him, its head slightly tilted, and then it blinked. Rowan lunged forward, yanking the sheet off his bed and throwing it over the mirror. His hands trembled as he stepped back, heart racing. This wasn't normal. Something was happening. Something was wrong, and tomorrow, he had to return to the theater. Rowan arrived at the Orpheus Theater the next evening with an uneasy weight in his chest. The events of the night before haunted him: the phantom applause, the mirror, the reflection that moved on its own. Now, as he stood beneath the glowing marquee, he felt like he was stepping onto a stage he couldn't leave. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy theater doors. Inside, the air was different. The place felt full, yet the only person visible was Mr. Duval, standing near the stage, waiting. "You're just in time," Duval said, his sharp smile unwavering. "Tonight, we begin the true rehearsal." Rowan hesitated. "Who else is performing?" Duval gestured toward the darkened balcony. Rowan turned his gaze upward. His stomach dropped. The balcony seats were occupied. Row upon row of marionettes sat in absolute silence, their painted eyes trained on the stage. His breath hitched. They hadn't been there before. "This is insane," Rowan muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not doing this." Duval's smile didn't waver. But you are." He extended a hand toward the stage curtain, and with a slow, deliberate motion, pulled it aside. Something waited in the wings, a table, and on it, an old leather-bound book. Rowan hesitated before stepping forward. Dust rose from the pages as he brushed his fingers over the cover. The book felt unnaturally warm. The title, engraved in faded gold, sent a chill through his spine. The Lost Performers, hard pounding. Rowan opened it. The pages weren't blank. They were filled with names, actors, performers, people. Some of them had been written in bold ink. Others were crossed out. Then at the bottom of the most recent page, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Rowan Carter, leading role. He staggered backward. "What the hell is this?" Duval only watched. "This isn't just a theater," Rowan whispered. "This is a..." He stopped. He didn't even want to say the word. Duval's voice was calm. "A stage needs its cast." Rowan's hands trembled as he flipped further through the book. Halfway through, the ink changed. The words became shaky, frantic, almost carved into the pages. A final entry stood out: "The game has begun. The only way to leave is to break the script, but beware. The master of puppets is always watching." Rowan's breath caught. Something moved behind him. Not Duval, something else. A shadow stretched along the floor, long, thin fingers extending toward him. A voice, soft as silk, whispered, "It's your turn to play." Rowan spun around. The shadow stretched across the wooden floor like ink spilling in reverse, pulling upward into something tall and inhuman. Then, from the darkness, he stepped forward. A figure in a black, featureless mask, dressed in a long velvet coat, adorned with silver embroidery that shimmered under the dim lights, but the most unnerving part, strings. Thin, silver strings extended from his wrists, his shoulders, and even his head, vanishing into the darkness above, and yet, nothing held them. Rowan's body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure tilted his head, as if stunning him. Then, in a voice both distant and near, he spoke. "Welcome to my stage, Rowan Carter." The sound sent an unnatural shiver through Rowan's spine. His lips parted, but no words came out. Duval finally stepped forward, his presence eerily calm. "Rowan, meet our esteemed host. He prefers to be called the Master of Puppets." The figure's voice cut through the air, finishing the sentence for him. Rowan swallowed hard. What do you want from me? The master of puppets let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. You already know. He lifted a gloved hand, extending a single finger toward the book of names still clutched in Rowan's trembling hands. Rowan looked down, his name bold and clear. Every performer must play their part. The master of puppets continued, you have been chosen. Rowan's grip tightened around the book. And if I refuse, the strings above them quivered. Then one of the marionettes in the audience moved. Its head snapped toward him, its painted lips parted. And in a voice that was barely human, it whispered, actors who refuse become part of the set. A sudden cold dread flooded Rowan's chest. The marionettes, they weren't props. They had been people. Rowan's hands shook. He could feel the weight of every eye in the theater, waiting for his decision. He was trapped, and the show was about to begin. Rowan's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The master of puppets stood before him, strings glinting like spider silk in the dim light. The marionettes in the audience watched, motionless but expectant. The theater was waiting. Duval stepped forward, his voice smooth as ever. It is time, Rowan. Take your place on the stage. Rowan's pulse pounded in his ears. What happens if I don't? The master of puppets slowly lifted a gloved hand. Above them, the unseen strings trembled, then movement. One of the marionettes in the front row jerked upright, its head snapping toward Rowan. The wooden figure lurched forward, stiffly climbing onto the stage. It turned its head and Rowan saw its eyes. They weren't painted, they were human. His stomach dropped. Someone had been here before him. Duval sighed. Every performance must have its players, Rowan. If the lead does not take the stage will take them instead. Rowan's fingers dug into his palms. He wasn't just trapped, he was replaceable. The master of puppets extended his hand again. Begin. The curtains pulled back on their own. The stage shifted, the wooden floor rearranging itself, forming a grand ballroom set with flickering chandeliers. It was impossible. It was alive. Rowan staggered as the air changed. The stage felt different now. The lines of reality blurred at the edges, like he was standing inside the script itself. The marionette that had climbed onto the stage suddenly turned toward him. Then it spoke. Its voice was flat, hollow, familiar. Dance, Rowan. The show must go on. Rowan's hands clenched. He wasn't going to let them control him. But then his body moved against his will. His feet slid forward in perfect, practiced steps. His arms lifted as if invisible strings had wrapped around his wrists. No, no. He fought, but his body obeyed the stage, the unseen force pulling him through the motions of a waltz he had never learned. The marionette moved with him, mirroring his steps. The audience watched in silence. The master of puppets stood at the edge of the stage, his head tilted, observing. And as Rowan's body twirled and bowed against his will, a horrifying realization struck him. This wasn't just a performance, it was a scripted fate, a cycle. And if he didn't find a way to break it, he wouldn't leave this stage alive. Rowan's body moved without his control. Each step of the dance was perfect, precise to perfect. The unseen strings tightened around his wrists, his ankles, guiding his every motion. He tried to resist, but it was like fighting against the tide. The marionette dancing with him moved in sync, its painted lips parted in an empty smile. The audience sat still, watching, waiting. And at the edge of the stage, the master of puppets observed. This was a game, and games had rules. Rowan's breath came in short gasps as his mind raced. Every actor before him had played along. They had followed the script. Let the theater take control, and they had never left. If he wanted to escape, he had to do something none of them had done. He had to break the script. His heart pounded as he made his decision. Rowan missed a step, a mistake, a deliberate one. The moment his foot landed out of place, the atmosphere shifted. The marionette dancing with him jerked. The air shuddered like the theater itself had noticed. Rowan clenched his jaw and did it again, another misstep. The music faltered, the audience murmured. On the edge of the stage, the master of puppets stiffened. His voice rang through the air, cold and sharp. Stay in your role, Rowan. But Rowan didn't. He forced his feet to stumble, his body breaking free of the invisible pole. He threw himself backward, away from the marionette. The audience whispered. The strings above trembled, the stage cracked. The master of puppets took a step forward, his hands lifted. The unseen strings lashed toward Rowan, trying to reclaim him. Rowan ran. He dove off the stage, sprinting toward the back of the theater. Behind him, the master of puppets' voice echoed like thunder. You cannot leave. The curtain has not fallen. Rowan didn't stop. The stage groaned. The marionettes lurched forward. He reached the heavy velvet curtain, his only way out. And as he grabbed the fabric, the theater itself seemed to scream. Rowan, the show is not over. He ripped the curtain down. And everything collapsed. The theater collapsed around him. Rowan's breath came in ragged gasps as the heavy velvet curtain ripped from its frame, sending dust and shadows spiraling through the air. The unseen strings snapped. The marionettes froze mid-step. And for the first time since he had stepped onto that cursed stage, the spell was breaking. But the master of puppets was not finished. His towering figure still stood at the edge of the stage, his black mask unreadable. The silver strings that had controlled Rowan moments ago whipped violently in the air, searching for him. Rowan staggered back, gripping the tattered curtain like a lifeline. The master tilted his head. You think you have one? His voice was calm to calm. Rowan swallowed, his pulse pounding. You said every show has its players, he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. Well, I'm not playing anymore. The master of puppets took a slow step forward. The entire theater darkened. The stage is eternal. Rowan, his voice was like silk over steel. No actor leaves before the final bow. The strings lashed toward him. Rowan acted on instinct. He threw the torn curtain into the air. The heavy fabric caught the invisible threads mid-air, and for a split second, the master of puppets hesitated. Rowan ran. He sprinted through the collapsing theater, past rows of motionless marionettes. The walls trembled, the chandeliers swayed, the stage was falling apart. But the doors, the same doors he had walked through on the first night, they were open. The master's voice howled through the theater. Rowan, the shadows lunged for him. He dove through the doors. Light swallowed him whole. The final scene, Rowan hit the pavement outside. The night air was cold, sharp real. He gasped, pushing himself upright. His chest rose and fell in panicked breaths. The Orpheus Theater stood behind him. Its marquee lights flickered, then dimmed completely. The heavy doors, the ones he had just escaped through, were gone. The entrance was now sealed shut, as if it had never been open at all. Rowan staggered backward, his mind reeling. The applause, the marionettes, the master of puppets, had it all been real? Or had he simply played a part in a game he was never meant to win? Then, from deep within the abandoned theater, something echoed. A slow, deliberate sound. Clap, clap, clap. The curtain had fallen. But the show was not over, and somewhere, the master of puppets was still watching.